Welcome to Talking with the Experts. This is where we discuss great ideas to take your business to the next level. How do we know these ideas work? Well, it's because we're talking with business owners who are using these ideas. Business owners who have years of experience and expertise. All things business by business owners for business owners. And now, here is your host, Rose Davidson.
Hi, I'm Rose Davidson from Talking with the Experts. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Global Glamping Charities for their valued support. Global Glamping Charities, solving homelessness in all its forms. Reach out to them at globalglamping.org.
Talking with the Experts.
In episode 464, Suzanne Jabour discusses with us how we can create a griever-friendly workplace.
We just need people to witness, right? We just need people to acknowledge, to mirror back, right? If you can just say to the person, oh my gosh, that's so terrible. It's okay to acknowledge that it's terrible. I think sometimes we don't want to say how terrible it is because we don't want to surprise the person with how terrible it is, or we don't want to say something about their loved one because we don't want to remind them that they're gone. But that person who's grieving absolutely knows it's terrible, and they know that their person is gone. So you're not reminding them. In fact, your acknowledgement often is a relief, because that sense that you have when you're grieving that there's something wrong with you, or that everyone else is managing to carry on with their normal life and your life still is shattered and you don't know what to do next. If someone else...
Talking with the Experts.
Hello and welcome to Talking with the Experts. I'm your host, Rose Davidson from rosedavidson.com. Talking with the Experts is all about business by business owners for business owners. You can find it on all good podcasting streaming platforms and on YouTube. Now, grievers at our business, both in our staff and in our clients, and most business owners don't know how to support them or create a griever-friendly workplace. And when we have the skills and the mindset to support them, we can build better relationships and promote loyalty. And my next guest, Suzanne Jabour, is going to be discussing with us how we can help us, not only ourselves, but the people around us through the grieving process. Now, Suzanne is a grieving mum who has found meaning in her loss through helping grievers and those who are supporting them. She now helps other grievers chart their unique grief path. She also works to help people and organisations build the skills and protocols to better support people who are grieving and normalize that grief as an expected and healthy part of our lives. She is a transformational coach and workshop leader and a certified grief educator. Suzanne, thank you so much for joining me today. We were talking a little bit off camera about how grief can affect all facets of our life. And I'm looking forward to learning more about how you can help people navigate the process through that. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so appreciative to people who are willing to open up this conversation, which for many of us, we would just like to turn tail and run away. So I really appreciate you creating this space to have this talk. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Absolutely. I think grief is something that we don't talk about. We don't understand it. When it happens to ourselves, there's the process that we go through. But when it's happening to someone around us, whether it be at the workplace or in family or friends, we always find it difficult to have those conversations. So firstly, I'd like to ask you how you came to be doing what you're doing. So what background is there that prompted you to want to help others?
Yeah, so I came to being a grief educator from my most recent loss, which was the death of my son, Ben, in September of 2020. He was 22, and that loss just hit me, as you would expect, I think. differently than any I had experienced before. My dad died when I was in my 30s and my mom when I was in my 40s. So it wasn't the first, close relation that I had lost. Of course, I'd gone through the sort of more normal losses of grandparents and, elder aunts and uncles and things like that. But there's something about the out of order death and the death of a child that for me just was a whole next level, experience that I was not completely unprepared for, because I had a robust sort of toolbox of skills, but not ones that I had used in grief before necessarily. And I was really surprised by a lot of what I now call sort of the symptoms of grief that nobody talks about. And that's the part where it really shows up in the workplace, right? When you're dealing with extreme brain fog and, sleep issues and digestive issues and, all the physical things that happen on top of the psychological things and the emotional things and, everything that's just going on. And part of what happened for me is I became so curious about why people who I had thought had, a really great set of tools and were really able to be, vulnerable and talk about difficult things, even those people couldn't show up for me. And there's this kind of acknowledged and accepted norm in grief that it will change your address book. And all I could think about was to wonder why. Like, why was that the case? Why were we so scared? And I know now, because I've surveyed enough people and talked to enough people, that it's because of fear, right? We're so scared that we're going to do the wrong thing and that we're going to hurt the person that we want the most to help, that we kind of end up tangled in our fear, and then we don't do anything. And then time passes and we haven't done anything. And then it's even more awkward to do something. And now we're just all in a tangle and everyone ends up feeling isolated. And I don't think it needs to be that way. And so what I try and do with people is have these conversations ahead of time. Like, this is something that is going to happen to all of us, especially right now. Everybody is feeling grief of one form or another, coming out of the last 3 years of dealing with COVID and its impacts on our lives. And, so many of us have lost people or multiple people. And if you haven't lost that, you've lost, on a big existential level, right? We've all lost our sense of how the world works and what normal even is. And on, things that we would kind of rank as being smaller, we've lost like graduations and ceremonies and weddings and vacations. And as we were saying before, that collegial going to the office, like the colleagues that you have and those acquaintances that you chat with in the coffee room or the lunchroom, for a lot of us that now work from home, that ended. So we have a lot of losses that we're kind of bypassing the grieving of. And that's part of what's really worrisome to me, and why I'm so passionate about opening up these conversations is, I don't think it needs to be that way. And I think we just all need to agree together, that it's going to be messy and we're not going to do it perfectly, but we're going to try our best. And that's how we're going to, I think, start to break down this isolation and the guilt and the shame and all of the stuff that comes up when we can't show up for each other. And then we feel badly about it. And then we're just all left feeling badly when really what we want and crave is that connection.
Yeah. My first dealing with grief was, when I was about 6 and my grandfather passed away. And then wasn't that long after, I'd lost a good friend from school who was, was unfortunately run over and died at the scene. And that was, really horrendous. And for me, my parents didn't help me deal with that grief at all. And whether, because I was a child, they probably thought, you'll just get over it. But it really stuck with me for a lot of years. And it took me a long time to get over that grief, even though, it happened when I was so young. I was probably in my 20s before I even, really dealt with the grief of that and worked out how I could get over and not think about, that poor young boy. But, there's other kinds of grief too, like estrangements in families, especially with your children. There is a huge feeling of loss, and it's hard to deal with as the individual who it's happening to, but when other family members are aware of this estrangement, they, all seem to come with their opinions but then don't help the person who's dealing with this. And so how can we better understand or allow others from the outside to understand what we're feeling?
First of all, I just want to acknowledge your loss. That's grief. That's where grief and trauma intersect, right? When you lose someone at a young age in such a traumatic way. And then, I absolutely get it. When my dad died, my daughter was 4, and people told me over and over again that she was too young to be grieving. And I kept telling them that I didn't care what they thought, but she was. And so could you help us, right? So there is that weird thought that there's an age where people are too young to be grieving, which, has some merit in some ways. But I also think that young people grieve. Absolutely. Young children understand a loss in a different way maybe than we do, but they experience it. So I'm so sorry that happened. And I'm so appreciative that you had that opportunity to really in your 20s kind of look back and go, well, wait, this thing happened and I'm still carrying that. I often explain it as like this backpack that we just want to keep stuffing our grief into and our losses because we don't want to acknowledge them or we don't know how. And so we just keep stuffing them in this backpack that eventually gets too heavy and we can't carry it anymore, or it explodes or something bad happens. So the more we can deal with it as it's happening, the better. And I think really part of what's hard with grief is we want to fix it. We want to go in and we want to make it better. And I think that's even more tangly with estrangement because, for me, Ben is gone. So there's no hope there that he will be back again physically in my world. But when you're talking about an estrangement, you carry that duality of deep grief and hope, because you hope that at some point this can resolve and turn into something other than what it is now, and you can be reconnected. And that sense of the complexity of that, I think, is overwhelming. And also because the person is still alive, I think people feel more like they can fix it. So they want to show up with all their suggestions and recommendations and all the things they think you should be doing, right? And that's where I love that Brené Brown idea, which is like, if you're not in the arena, like if this is not happening to you, I am not here to listen to your suggestions. Like, thank you so much, but I'm not interested, right? Which is so hard for us to hold that boundary. I think the thing that's fairly universal for people who are experiencing grief from losses, big and small, estrangements, deaths, lost jobs, businesses, there's so many of them right now. We just need people to witness, right? We just need people to acknowledge, to mirror back, right? If you can just say to the person, oh my gosh, that's so terrible. It's okay to acknowledge that it's terrible. I think sometimes we don't want to say how terrible it is because we don't want to surprise the person with how terrible it is. Or we don't want to say something about their loved one because we don't want to remind them that they're gone. But that person who's grieving absolutely knows it's terrible, and they know that their person is gone. So you're not reminding them. In fact, your acknowledgement often is a relief, because that sense that you have when you're grieving that there's something wrong with you, or that everyone else is managing to carry on with their normal life and your life still is shattered and you don't know what to do next. If someone else from that normal life that's carrying on, it feels like without you in those early days, right? Like you leave the funeral and everyone gets back in their car and goes to the grocery store and lives their life, and you're still left with these shattered pieces, right? If someone from that kind of normal world comes back to you and touches base on occasion to just say, yeah, it's okay. Like, I know this is terrible. It's terrible. And, I'm here for you. I think we've all been a bit led astray by the platitudes and cliches that we've learned from the past, and they really don't serve us any longer. So I love for people to do it. I do this in workshops sometimes. We do a brainstorming, we write them all down. And then I tell people to look at that list, and, we're making this pledge that we're never going to say any of those things again because they're so terrible. Right. And it's funny when you start to make a list of them and write them down, then you're like, oh, these are atrocious. But if you can just speak honestly to the person, and especially in a work situation, if you're the boss or the supervisor or the colleague, There's a different kind of relationship. You're not necessarily going to bring them food or show up to help with their garden or, all of those things you might do for someone who you're friends with outside of the workplace. But there are really things you can do in the workplace that help with those symptoms that we were talking about, that brain fog, being able to remember what day it is, right? I spend a lot of time not knowing what day it is. And I'm like over 2.5 years in now to this, this grief journey. So if you can help with those kinds of things, what would happen if you had a big calendar on the wall or somewhere where everybody had it? Or, now with technology, we can all add events to each other's calendars, and lots of workspaces have, Google Teams or things like that, where you have these shared documents and shared calendars. And what's interesting about it is so many of the things that often come up as ways to scaffold and support someone who's grieving ultimately help all of us. So, you're doing it because someone needs extra support, but the side benefit of it is for everybody else, it releases a whole bunch of the brain capacity they're using trying to remember stuff, and actually lets us do, creative problem solving and project completion and, fun things like that, which are way better for the business than if we're spending our time trying to remember, oh, shoot, is that meeting on Tuesday or Wednesday, right? Because if it's all documented somewhere and we all know where we can go to find it, that frees up that mental capacity to do much more interesting and exciting things.
Yeah. And I think that, the person who's grieving, the support that they receive from colleagues is, as you say, just a shared calendar, for instance, or, just to make a bit more effort to, go and have a bit of a chat to them and just check up on them and see how they're going. How's your day going? Something you need help with, just some sort of empathy and some sort of deeper connection, I think is can be so helpful to for the grieving person, that that they can, know that they're supported in some way. If it's only something small, it doesn't have to be a great gesture or a huge gesture, just something small enough for them to remember and to help them navigate the shitty feelings that they're having.
Yeah. And I think, there's all the practical things too, right? Like if we're doing a big project, how can we break it down? How can we share some of the load? Would it be helpful for someone to remind you about deadlines, right? That calendaring kind of stuff. Would it be helpful if for a little while someone took some of your duties, right? And it all needs to be done in conjunction with the griever. It's so interesting to me. I was messaging with a woman the other day, and she was saying she ended up leaving her job. So she had a job where they had really provided her a lot of support. She was another mom who lost a son. And the problem, though, then became there was no way for them to release that support and for her to step fully back into her role. And she became in the office the woman who lost a son, and she didn't feel like she could ever move from that identity. So she ended up leaving the company. So even with all these great intentions, they had kind of made a mess of it because it wasn't being led by her. It wasn't being done in consultation with her. So that's the thing that's so important too. And the other thing to remember is, I was a griever who grieved out loud. I just had to. That was the only way I was going to survive. But there's a whole spectrum of how people want to mourn. So if the external part is the mourning, I just mourned out loud. I was a hot mess everywhere. I was very grateful I was in a workplace where that was okay and people understood, and I had a lot of grace because of the kind of loss I had dealt with. But there are other grievers too who want to come to work almost as a respite from their grief. So they want to come and at least have a sense that, like, for this 7.5 or 8 hours or however long, I'm going to be as normal as I can. And something that can help those grievers is having a place where if you get overwhelmed and you lose that thread of like, okay, I'm just here being my old self and trying to be normal and be productive, to have a space where you can go where you're overwhelmed is really amazing too. And that all, that's another thing. It serves everybody. Like we all have moments of overwhelm at the office. And if we knew that there's like this pretty, I don't know, pick a pretty corner somewhere that's like the quiet corner in kindergarten, that you just know if someone goes there, they just need a minute. They don't need a big production number, right? No one needs to go and hold their hand or bring them tea or anything. They just need a minute. And then they're going to, we are all pretty good at self-regulating for the most part. They're going to get it back together. And then they kind of come back. And we could all use that space, right? So we're not really doing anything for grievers that doesn't also benefit the rest of us and give us all that understanding that we're actually okay to bring our whole selves to work. It's okay to be at work and feel overwhelmed by something. It's okay to be at work and have feelings and have conversations and have, that sense of, I always start with talking about how, we really need to learn how to understand our emotions better and have a better vocabulary than kind of the mad, sad, glad trifecta, right? We need to dig a little deeper than that. And we need to be a little more vulnerable than maybe we're comfortable. So that, of course, is things, most of us don't practice that at the workplace. We don't necessarily practice it very well with our closest friends and family. But if you could start with your closest friends and family, start with small, safe spaces at work. If we can create that sense of connection, and you mentioned empathy, like that's the other thing that's brilliant about showing up to support someone. You're building all that empathy muscle. So we're all kind of in training together, right? As if we were at the gym, just building these muscles that we don't use all the time that really would help us feel so much more connected in this time when I think so many of us feel isolated and fractured off from each other.
And another thing too is that, when someone's grieving and others around them, you don't want to mention the deceased person because, for fear of, and again, based on fear, for fear of upsetting the person who's mourning. However, sometimes, it's like the deceased person has just disappeared and has never existed. And that could be quite traumatic as well. Because, sometimes the person that's mourning want to talk about the deceased person because it allows them to still feel close to them in some way. And, to ignore the deceased person is like, it can be even more traumatic for the person.
Yeah. And it feels really isolating. Right? Because if I'm thinking about Ben a lot, which I do because, he's my child. So I think about him a lot. And then if someone else comes to me and says, oh my gosh, I was thinking about him the other day, or I saw this funny thing that reminded me of him, or remember that time when that's a real gift to me. Because then I know that other people remember too. And so then even if, as we were talking about before, like everyone else has kind of gone back to their normal life and you're still kind of struggling to figure out what next normal is and who you are and what your life is going to look like, and all those big things, to know that other people still remember is really helpful. I often suggest to people that, a really lovely thing to do is to put, the day that the person died in your calendar with an annual, repeat an annual repeat and a couple days ahead reminder, and to just send someone a text message saying, thinking about you and your person, whoever it is today, to know other people remember and that other people care enough to say something. It releases some of that isolation, because grief can be very isolating. You're in the depths of something that we all try as little as possible to talk about and acknowledge that it's a thing. That's really isolating, right? And because we don't talk about it, so many of the things that happen to you come as a surprise. So you're experiencing something like brain fog, which is super common. But when it happened to me this time, I had no idea that was a thing. So of course you think you're losing your mind and there's something wrong with you and this has never happened to anyone else. If we can take anything away from this conversation, it's that if you're feeling it and experiencing it in grief, it's probably happened to someone else as well. Like there's such commonality of our experiences, even though they're really unique. But because we don't talk about it, we don't say, oh my gosh, like for months and months after, my digestive system was a hot mess and I couldn't sleep and my hands and my feet were all tingly. Nobody's telling you any of that. So when it happens to you, you think something's wrong. But it's really not. It's just how grief works.
Yeah, and grief affects people, each individual differently. There's no cut and paste or one size fits all or any of that
No.
sort of stuff. People deal with it and are affected by it in such huge ways that there should be well, you can't even write a manual on it really because it's so diverse. It's just it's an individual thing.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly some commonalities and some more common things than others. But yeah, and what's interesting about it too is that for the person who's grieving, it's different every time. Like my grief for my dad was different than my grief for my mom, and is different from my grief for Ben, and is different for my grief for all the other things. So it's really, that's part of what makes it tricky, is that even if you go into it thinking, oh yeah, I've done this before, I know how to do it, you get smacked in the face with something or other you weren't expecting. And then you're kind of back to square one going, wait, like I thought I had this nailed. And all of a sudden it's a completely new experience.
Yeah, I totally get it. I think it's it's especially if it's a child, I mean, or a spouse, I think, and even, the feelings and emotions that go with that are, are different again because of, the connection that you've got with that individual. However, it can be, it's, I don't know, I can't explain it. It's here, it's feeling, I can feel it in my heart, but it's hard to express. But, a lot of us, when we're talking to someone who's had a loss, we're ourselves at a loss for words, what to say. Do you just say, oh, my condolences, or I'm sorry for your loss, or, what are the things that you shouldn't say, perhaps, rather than things that you should say?
Yeah, I jokingly say, if you heard your Aunt Mildred say it to your mom at your grandma's funeral, you probably shouldn't say it, right? So all those old cliches and platitudes, really, they just don't serve us anymore. They feel like they're from like a past generation. I have a theory about them being from around the 50s, right? Where we were all pretending to be the Cleavers, and we were on the exterior, everything was fine. And we were just gonna, get over it and move on and, get stronger and be more resilient, all that malarkey that people say. I am a fan of I'm so sorry. Condolences to me feels weirdly, I don't know, old fashioned somehow. If that's something that you feel like you would naturally say, by all means. For me, that just feels kind of weird in my mouth. What I really encourage people to do is just speak from the heart, speak what's true for you. It's okay to share how you're feeling. You're not, not to hijack what they're feeling or, center yourself, right? But there's something to be said for acknowledging that what's happening is awful. I say to people regularly, like, I so wish this wasn't happening to you. Like, I wish you weren't going through this, but you are. And so, what do we do next? And I think it's okay too. I found it really comforting for people to say they didn't know what to say. So if you genuinely don't feel like you know what to say, it's okay to say that. And then say whatever comes next, right? I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. This is terrible. And I'm here for you.
Yeah,
and I care about you. And can I make you a cup of tea? Right? I'm just here to be with you. I wish I could fix it, but I can't. So let me just be here with you.
I think that is a brilliant way of going about it without stepping on anyone's toes or their feelings or their emotions at all, and not minimizing how they might be feeling, because you don't know. It's their feelings. And sometimes they just can't express how they're feeling because they don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of why, I really encourage people to find a feeling wheel or an emotion wheel. There's tons of them on the internet. Google has lots of them. They're all great. I don't need to make one because there's many, many out there. But if we can be practicing ahead of time, right? Getting down to more nuanced emotions, like breaking up that sort of mad, sad, glad trifecta we were talking about, and having that sense too of breaking up the paradigm where there's positive and negative emotions or good and bad emotions. when you're in grief, the vast majority of the ones that you're feeling all in a tangle at the same time are from that sort of more negative or bad list, if you're buying into that paradigm, which is how most of us were raised, right? We're encouraged to be happy, not grumpy, right? No parent ever said, oh, please be more grumpy, right? I wish we had, but that's not how I was raised. So you're stuck in that tangle of all those negative emotions, like the emotions you've kind of been discouraged your whole life from expressing. And that's overwhelmingly what's coming at you. So that's really disorienting too. So if we can be practicing with smaller losses, if we can be practicing with minor disappointments, then we're building our repertoire and our ability to express what's really going on for us. And then when the catastrophic ones happen, we've built that muscle a little bit. So we have a little bit more ability to express what's really going on for us and to show up for someone who's in that place more honestly and more vulnerably.
Yeah, I think honesty is always the best policy.
Yeah.
Suzanne, where can people find you if they want to work with you?
The best place to find me is on my website, which is alivedexperience.com. And there's links there to all my social media. So if you're a Facebook person, you can click there, Instagram, all those kinds of places. There's links there, which is the easiest way to find people on those places. And any workshops that I have coming up are listed there. I have a newsletter, so you can sign up for the newsletter and get my calling them tips and tricks always sounds kind of weird. So ideas and suggestions, I'm playing with that languaging. It's better. Funny when, when you're talking about grief, to say like my best tips and tricks just seems kind of flippant somehow. No. Ideas and suggestions, just ways to kind of open that conversation, ways to talk about it. And I break those down always in the newsletter, something for if you're grieving, if you're supporting someone, and then what about at work? Like, how do we make this work in our companies? And really create a space where it's okay to come as your whole self to work, not in a way that's, disruptive or inappropriate, but you can come as your whole self. And we all have, we're all carrying something. And if we can carry those burdens together, it's just somehow easier.
Absolutely. Now, you shared with me a document that you want me to pass on to our viewers and listeners. So can you explain what that document is, please?
Yeah, it's a little short ebook, which has sort of a breakdown of how grief might show up at work and some things that you can do. So it's a really great starting point if you've either not thought about this at all or thought there's something weird going on and I wonder what it is. It might be grief, especially right now when really, I will argue to anybody that everybody's grieving something and we're just all kind of pretending that we're not. And has some ideas and suggestions of places you can start. And it's just, I think it's about 6 pages. So it's a super short read. It's not intended to be overwhelming or heavy. I found for me, especially in the early days of grief, I couldn't read anything very dense. So it's really designed to be an easy read, just to give you a starting point, and get a sense of kind of what I think and what I think would be helpful. So yeah, that's great. If people can access that, it's really super helpful.
A great document. And I'll make sure that I share the link to that in the show notes. Suzanne, if you were to offer any advice to somebody, what would that be?
So if you're a griever, I would say just know that whatever you're experiencing is probably normal. And as much as that is terrible, it's probably normal. So, you're not losing your mind. There's nothing wrong with you. It's been felt by someone before. If you're a business owner or you're looking at your workplace and your staff, I would love for you to have a conversation with them and just say, you know what, I was listening to this podcast the other day. You could play it for them. You could give it as a signed listing on the way home if you'd like. But to just open up the conversation and just to say, like I'm realizing as I look around, there's grief all around us right now. And who's feeling it? Who doesn't understand what's going on for them? And maybe it's grief. And is there a space we can talk about it and come up together with, what would we like that to look like here? And that's certainly something that I love to do with companies. But, there's a lot of business owners that can at least start the conversation, at least express that they understand and they're open to you coming to work as your whole self. that really creates a lot of safety for people. And ultimately, most business owners want to help people because they're great humans, but it also impacts your bottom line, right? If you're losing staff because they don't feel supported and you're having to go through a hiring and training and all of that stuff. And same with customers. If you're losing people because they don't feel comfortable, that's hurting your bottom line and it's impacting your ability to do a great job. And that's really important too.
Absolutely. Great wisdom there. Thank you for sharing that. Suzanne, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
Talking with the experts.